I didn't hear the door open. The steam from my shower clung to the air, thick and hazy, curling against the bathroom mirror as I stepped out, towel slung low around my waist. I ran a hand through my damp hair, my mind still half lost in the warmth of the water, the quiet hum of solitude that I rarely got in this house. And then I felt it, something off, a shift in the air. I turned. Kevin stood in the doorway. His hand was still on the doorknob, his body frozen in place like his brain hadn't caught up with what his eyes were seeing. For a moment, neither of us moved. His gaze flickered downward, just for a split second, before he jerked his head away, his face flushing crimson. Shit. He took a quick step back, nearly tripping over himself as he scrambled to turn around. I didn't think anyone was in here. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my voice to stay calm. It's fine. Just knock next time, all right? Kevin nodded stiffly, eyes still averted. Yeah, of course. Sorry. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I let out a breath, running a hand down my face. My pulse was still racing, though I wasn't sure why. Embarrassment? Awkwardness? Something else? I shook my head, gripping the towel tighter around my waist as I turned back to the mirror. It was nothing. A mistake. An awkward moment that we'd both pretend never happened. At least, that's what I told myself. Dinner that night was quiet. Kevin kept his eyes glued to his plate, shoveling food into his mouth like he was in a rush to be anywhere but here. Usually, he'd talk about soccer practice or whatever game he was obsessed with that week, but tonight, silence. I cleared my throat. How was practice? Fine. Short. Clipped. Unlike him. I took a sip of my drink, watching him. His fingers tapped against the edge of the table, a nervous habit of his. And then, for the briefest second, his eyes flicked up, meeting mine. It was quick, too quick, but something passed between us in that moment. Something I couldn't name. Something I didn't dare name. Kevin looked away first, pushing his plate back. I'm gonna head upstairs. I nodded, pretending not to notice the tension in his shoulders as he stood up. All right, and just like that, he was gone. I exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of my neck. It was nothing, just an awkward moment between two people who barely knew how to exist around each other. But somehow, it didn't feel that way. Somehow, it felt like something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I was ready to figure out what that meant. The next morning, I expected things to go back to normal. Kevin would come down for breakfast, distracted by his phone, maybe mumble a half-hearted morning before heading out to practice. I'd sip my coffee, check my emails, and pretend last night's weirdness never happened. Except, he didn't come down. By the time noon rolled around, I found myself standing outside his bedroom door, hesitating before I knocked. Kevin. Silence. I knocked again, firmer this time. Hey, you feeling all right? A pause. Then, finally, the sound of movement inside. The door cracked open just enough for me to see him, his face shadowed by the dim light of his room. Yeah, he said, his voice hoarse like he hadn't spoken all morning. Just tired. I frowned. You didn't eat. Kevin shrugged, scratching the back of his neck. Not hungry. Something fell off. He wasn't looking at me. Not fully. His gaze hovered somewhere over my shoulder, avoiding eye contact like it physically pained him. I sighed, leaning against the doorframe. Look, about yesterday. His entire body tensed. You don't have to. I know. I held up a hand. I just wanted to say it's not a big deal. Awkward? Sure. But it happens. We move on. Kevin swallowed, nodding. Yeah. His fingers curled around the edge of the door, like he was debating whether to shut it or step out. For a second, it felt like he might actually say something else, like there was a whole conversation waiting just behind his teeth. But instead, he just nodded again. Cool. Thanks. And then the door shut. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain, a strange knot forming in my stomach. Why did this feel bigger than it was? The tension between us didn't dissolve overnight. If anything, it lingered. Kevin wasn't avoiding me exactly, but he wasn't acting normal either. There was hesitation in the way he moved around me, a quiet awareness that hadn't been there before. And then, one evening, the universe decided to make things even more complicated. I was in the living room, flipping through the channels when Kevin came in, fresh from a shower, his damp hair sticking up in odd directions. He was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, Nothing special, except it was the first time in days he'd willingly entered the same space as me. He hesitated, then sat down on the couch. Not too close, but not as far away as he could have. I kept my focus on the TV. Movie. He shrugged. Sure. For the next 20 minutes, we sat in silence, the glow of the screen flickering across our faces. But I could feel it, the tension, the unspoken weight pressing between us. Then, out of nowhere, Kevin shifted. Can I ask you something? I glanced over. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something raw. Of course. He exhaled, his fingers gripping the hem of his shirt. Have you ever felt something you weren't supposed to? The question hung in the air like static electricity. My pulse stuttered. What do you mean? Kevin's jaw tightened. Like, you think you know who you are, what you want. And then something happens, and suddenly, you don't. The way he said it, carefully, deliberately, sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a random question. This was about him, about me, about whatever had shifted between us in that brief, unspoken moment days ago. I swallowed, my throat dry. Yeah, I said finally. I have. Kevin nodded, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath. Neither of us looked at the screen anymore. Kevin didn't bring it up again. For days, we danced around it. The unspoken question, the weight of what he'd asked me that night. But even in silence, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way he lingered in the same room longer than before, in the way his gaze hovered just a second too long before flicking away. And I wasn't innocent in this, either. I caught myself watching him more, noticing things I shouldn't. The way he bit his lip when he was thinking, the way his fingers twitched when he was restless, the way he studied me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. His expression caught somewhere between curiosity and something heavier. I told myself it was nothing, a passing phase, a result of that stupid, awkward moment we'd both blown out of proportion. But deep down, I knew better. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened again, one of those moments that seemed small but left a mark. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when Kevin wandered in, rubbing the back of his neck like he had something on his mind. He hesitated by the fridge, then finally spoke. You ever think about stuff too much? I glanced at him. All the time. He let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. No, like, to the point where it messes you up. Like you can't stop thinking about something and it just keeps circling back over and over. I put the knife down, wiping my hands on a towel. Sounds like you have something specific in mind. He hesitated. Then, finally, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Do you ever question things about yourself? My throat went dry. I could feel it, the weight behind his words, the careful way he chose them. I swallowed. Yeah, more than I'd like to admit. Kevin nodded slowly, like he was turning that over in his head. Then, almost too quiet to hear, he muttered, That's what I thought. I could have pushed, asked what exactly he was questioning, but something told me he wasn't ready. So I just said, Figuring yourself out takes time. Kevin's lips pressed into a thin line. What if you don't like the answer? I met his gaze, steady. Then you keep looking, until you do. For a moment, he just stood there, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and left. I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. This was getting dangerous. The tension between us stretched tight over the next few weeks, invisible but always there. Kevin didn't avoid me anymore. If anything, he sought me out more often. He'd find reasons to stay in the same room, to start conversations that didn't need starting. I'd catch him watching me, his gaze thoughtful, studying. It was in the little things, the way his body angled toward mine when we talked, the way he hesitated before saying good night, like there was something else on the tip of his tongue. And then there were the touches, accidental at first, brushing past each other in the hallway, hands grazing when reaching for the same thing, his knee pressing against mine when we sat on the couch, neither of us moving away. Each time, I told myself it was nothing. Each time, I told myself I was imagining it, until I couldn't anymore. One night, I was in the living room, a book in my hands, but my mind miles away. Kevin walked in, stretching, his shirt riding up just enough to reveal a sliver of skin. I forced my eyes back to the pages, pretending I wasn't affected. He flopped onto the couch beside me, letting out a long breath. I feel like my head's gonna explode. I smirked, glancing over. Deep thoughts again? Kevin huffed. Always. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the TV in the background. Then, softly, he said, I think I like someone. My grip tightened on the book. Yeah. He nodded. Yeah, but it's complicated. I swallowed. Complicated how? Kevin's gaze flickered toward me, something uncertain in his expression. Then, instead of answering, he shifted closer, his knee pressing firmly against mine. I didn't move. Neither did he. The air felt electric, every second stretching unbearably long. Kevin exhaled, his fingers tapping against his thigh. I don't know what to do with it. I forced my voice to stay steady. You don't have to do anything. Not until you're sure. He nodded slowly, like he was turning my words over in his mind. Then, finally, he muttered, I think I am. My heart pounded. I should have said something. Anything to stop this from going where it was going. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I should have stopped it. The way Kevin looked at me. The way his knee pressed against mine. The warmth seeping through my jeans. The way his voice dropped to something almost uncertain. Almost afraid. I should have told him to be careful with whatever he thought he was feeling. That it was complicated. That he was young and figuring himself out, and maybe I wasn't the right person for him to test those feelings on. But I didn't, because I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. And that was the problem. Things shifted after that night, but neither of us acknowledged it. The silences between us grew heavier. The looks lingered longer. The air felt charged with something we weren't naming. It was dangerous. I knew that, and yet I kept finding myself drawn into it. Into him. And then it snapped. It was late, too late for either of us to be awake. I had been sitting on the porch, nursing a drink, letting the cool air clear my thoughts when Kevin stepped outside. He hesitated for a second, then sat down next to me. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. But he spoke anyway. You're avoiding me. I let out a slow breath. I'm not. You are, he said, voice quiet but firm. And I don't get why. I swallowed, staring at the ice melting in my glass. I just think we should be careful. Kevin didn't respond right away. Then softer why. I finally turned to face him. The porch light cast half his face in shadow, but his eyes, God, his eyes, were so open, so raw. You know why? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kevin's jaw tightened. I don't. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. Because this is complicated, Kevin. You're figuring yourself out, and that's okay. But you shouldn't do it with me. A flicker of something crossed his face. Hurt, frustration, maybe both. So what? He asked, his voice sharp. I don't get a say in this. I clenched my jaw. It's not about that. Then what is it about? He demanded, his voice rising. Because I've never felt like this before, and He stopped himself, exhaling harshly, raking his fingers through his hair. I closed my eyes. Kevin, no, he interrupted. Don't do that. Don't say my name like that, like you're trying to make this go away. I opened my eyes. I'm trying to protect you. His laugh was bitter. From what? I stared at him, my heart pounding. From making a mistake. Silence. Kevin's throat bobbed as he swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it cut through me like a blade. Or are you just protecting yourself? The words hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth, then closed it, because maybe he wasn't wrong. Maybe I wasn't just afraid for him. Maybe I was afraid for me too. Afraid of how easy it was to let myself want this. Want him. Kevin stood abruptly. I need to think. I nodded, throat tight. Okay. He turned, stepping back inside without another word. And I sat there, staring into the night, knowing nothing would be the same after this. I hadn't seen Kevin all day. After last night, after the argument, the rawness of it, I wasn't sure if he was avoiding me or if I was avoiding him. Maybe both. But by evening, the silence was unbearable. I found him outside, sitting on the back steps, staring up at the sky. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped between his knees. He looked lost in thought, the way I'd seen him 100 times before. But tonight, there was something different in the way he held himself, like he was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. I hesitated at the door, unsure if I should go to him. Before I could decide, he spoke. You ever feel like you're standing on the edge of something? His voice was quiet, almost lost to the night air. I swallowed. Yeah. Kevin exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do. I took a step forward, then another, until I was close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cool night air. About what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He turned his head, finally looking at me. His eyes were raw, searching. You know what? I did, and still I hesitated. I wanted to say something safe, something that would make this easier for both of us. But there was nothing safe about this. Nothing easy. Instead, I sank down beside him, staring straight ahead. What are you afraid of? He was silent for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, that it's real. My chest tightened. Kevin let out a shaky breath, running his hands over his jeans. I've spent so much time trying to figure myself out. Try to push this down. Ignore it. But then, he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Then there's you. I swallowed, my pulse roaring in my ears. Kevin, I know what you're going to say, he cut in, that this is complicated. I'm still figuring things out. That I should take my time. And maybe you're right. He turned fully toward me now, and I felt the weight of his gaze settle over me like gravity. But what if I already know? The world felt too still, too quiet. I shook my head, my voice barely steady. Kevin, this isn't just about what you want. It's about what's right. His jaw tightened. And who gets to decide that? I exhaled sharply, raking a hand through my hair. This is bigger than you think. Kevin scoffed, frustration flashing in his eyes. Bigger than what I feel. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I looked at him then, really looked at him, the uncertainty, the frustration, the raw vulnerability. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he needed time, that this wasn't a good idea. But the truth was, I wanted this too. I had wanted it for longer than I cared to admit. The only thing stopping me was fear. Kevin studied my face, his expression softening. And then, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. A small touch, barely anything, but it was enough to set my whole body on edge. I'm not asking for forever, he whispered. I'm just asking you to stop running from this. My breath caught, because for the first time, I wasn't sure I could. Kevin didn't move his hand. Neither did I. The space between us felt small now, too small to hide in, too small to pretend that this wasn't happening. I had spent so much time resisting, convincing myself that wanting this was wrong, that letting him would only lead to hurt. But sitting here, with his fingers brushing mine, his breath unsteady as he waited for my answer, I realized something. The fear had never been about him. It had always been about me, about what it would mean if I let myself have this. If I stopped fighting, stopped making excuses, stopped pushing him away. Kevin's voice was barely above a whisper. Say something. I exhaled, looking down at our hands. His fingers were calloused, warm, real. I curled mine around his. Kevin sucked in a sharp breath. His eyes searched mine, waiting, always waiting for me to meet him halfway. And for once I did. I'm scared, I admitted. Kevin let out a quiet laugh, relief, and something softer flickering across his face. Yeah, me too. We sat there, hands intertwined, the night stretching around us. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time, it felt right. Kevin squeezed my fingers, a small smile playing on his lips. So what now? I thought about all the reasons I told myself we couldn't do this. All the things that could go wrong. And then, for the first time, I let myself think about what could go right. I met his gaze, my own smile slow, uncertain, but real. Now, I said, we figure out. Together. Kevin's smile widened, something bright and certain in his eyes. And when he leaned in, slow and cautious, giving me every chance to pull away, I didn't.